Is that the troublemakers can stay in the back? Oh, shoot. So this is the PKAN session. We're going to start in just a few minutes. And I'm going to, so the very first session is we're going to be talking a little bit about the COASY clinical trial. And so if there's anybody from any pharmaceutical companies or any clinicians who are specifically consulting on any of the other trials, we're going to ask you just to hold yourself outside for the first half hour, and we're going to just talk to the families. Yeah.
Is everybody in here from a PKAN family? I think, is everybody in here, except our clinicians, from a PKAN family?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay.
But not everybody's here yet.
All right, we're going to wait just a couple of minutes for other folks to come.
So we're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves first, though, and then Penny's going to talk a little bit. So I'm Susan Hayflick. I'm a medical geneticist from Oregon. Been at this for 30-plus years. Really happy to be seeing everybody here.
Thanks. Vince, would you mind pulling the door to for a second, since you're the closest? Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Penny Hogarth. I think I've met many of you. I'm a clinician, a neurologist, and I have been the principal investigator on the COASY clinical trial. We wanted to take this first few minutes of the PKAN session to meet with just the families, with nobody else in the room, except some clinicians, to talk to you about our very, very, very preliminary results from, sorry, are people having trouble hearing me? Yeah. Boom, I need to.
Just introduce everybody before you do that.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Hold it closer.
Okay, I'm holding it closer.
I'm Allison Gregory. I think almost every single one of you knows me pretty well by now. I'm from OHSU. I'm really happy to see you all here.
I'm Mariam Hall. I'm from Baylor, Texas Children's, and I'm a movement disorders neurologist.
I'm Jenny Wilson, also from Portland, Oregon. I'm a pediatric neurologist.
Okay, so I think we have a couple of people in here who were not involved in the trial. So I want to give just a little bit of orientation to the trial. So this was a clinical trial of looking at a compound that tries to bypass that block that exists in PKAN in the vitamin pathway that is kind of messed up in PKAN. And we were trying to bypass that roadblock with something else that we called CoAZ. And the trial was run to test 3 different doses of CoAZ plus a placebo. So something that looks like CoAZ but doesn't have any actual medicine in it. And then that was done for 6 months. People were put into one group or the other in a way that I couldn't see, and you all who were in the trial couldn't see. And then the second part of the trial was a year and a half, 18 months, of people taking only CoAZ at 1 dose. We call that open label, that second part. So the first part is called double blind, because I don't know and you don't know, so we're both kind of blind. And the second part is what we call open label. So since you all finished the clinical trial, and the last person exited the trial last fall, we had literally thousands of samples from you in the freezer, and we have been focusing our attention on the first 6 months of the trial, which is the most critical part for us to answer the questions we wanted to answer, which were, first and foremost, is this stuff safe to give to people? Can people take it without having too much in the way of side effects or other problems? And then the part that we were really interested in was, does it change this measure in blood that would tell us that it's potentially making a difference to PKAN? And so what I'm here to tell you is from this first 6 months is, as to what we know so far, that it looks like it's safe, it looks like people could take it without side effects for the most part, and it did change that measure in blood, which is super exciting to us. It might not sound so exciting, but it is. It really is. It is the first clinical trial, I think, that has really shown that in a compelling way. This measure that we were testing in blood is a very direct way of sort of looking at what PKAN is doing to the body. And so we are, just to give you an idea, if any of you have ever been around statistics people, it takes a lot to get statistics people excited. And our statistician, who really was the one who had the first look at our information, our data, when she got on the meeting with us, she said, "I am so excited to show you these results." So we're pretty excited about it. This blood measure that we have is something that the Food and Drug Administration specifically wanted to see, to show that CoAZ was doing what we proposed it would do. And, you know, we based this on mice, on cells and then mice, and then a really small number of people who came to Oregon, who participated in Oregon in the very preliminary trial with just 6 people. And these were tiny clues that we were on the right track. And then we had to make this huge jump off the cliff, doing this huge trial with 70 people basically involved in the trial. I think we had nearly 70 people with PKAN all around America and Canada. And we just didn't know going into it if we were on the right track or not. But it is to us a very powerful result that we are on the right track. So we're super, super encouraged by this. I want to just stop there and see what questions people have, and then I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what our next plans are. And I should say first that So we haven't put anything out to the community yet. You are the first people who are hearing this. We are preparing a kind of a message out that will go out to the people who were in the clinical trial via our communication systems that we've set up with everybody that was in the trial so that they can have it in front of them. You all can read it again and kind of absorb the information, tell you a little bit about what our next plans are, and then we're actually going to ask you to complete an anonymous survey about some follow-on studies that we're planning that I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. So let me just take a breath there and see what questions people have. I've stunned you all into silence or bored you. Yes? It's a super good question. So we're still digging into those data, that data right now. I'm sorry. So the question was a very smart one. Was there a difference between people with classic PKAN, meaning the early onset, so childhood onset, and kind of more aggressive PKAN, or people with atypical PKAN who have later onset, slower progression? And we suspect so, but we're still looking at those data. And remember, 70 people with that many dose groups, so we had 4 groups we were putting people in, and for the main part of the trial, it was actually only 64 people, so 15 people in each group. That's not terribly many, 15, 16 people. It's not terribly many to be able to see those differences, but we're sorting that out now, and by the time we're ready to share the data in detail, I think we'll be able to drill into that a little more with more detail. Okay? Yeah, Sarah. It's actually not quite, it was a pretty different trial. So in the Netherlands, just in the Netherlands, little tiny country, right? It is still concluding, they will be wrapping up soon, a pretty different design because they didn't have enough people to be able to put people in lots of different dose groups. And so they had people on one dose, off one dose, on another dose, off that dose. And it's hard to draw too many conclusions. They don't have information yet. They don't have their data yet because they haven't finished the trial. But that is ongoing. And then there is another trial that is still in the planning phase in Europe as well, which we'll be able to tell you more about come times. Yeah. You said there were 4 different doses that were given in the clinical trial. Did you see a difference in those doses? Yeah, so the question was, in the double-blind portion, so the first 6 months, which is really what we've looked at so far, because that's much the most important part of the study, was there a difference between the dose groups? So there was a placebo group, no medicine, a low-dose group, a medium-dose group, and a high-dose group. And when we use those terms, low, medium, and high, it just means one was higher than the other. Actually, we are seeing some differences between the dose groups, which is something, again, maybe on your side of the fence, it's hard for you to kind of grasp this, but we did not think we had enough people. Usually when you do studies like this, you have thousands and thousands of people doing a trial of a trial to control blood pressure, for instance. When you work in a rare disease and you can only, in your wildest imagination, get 12 to 15 people in each dose group, it's a bit of a moonshot, a bit of a long shot to think you're going to see a difference between doses. And in fact, we did see differences between doses, which, well, it's what we call a dose response. So, and this is something that in the follow-on studies we want to figure more out about, but it suggested that the higher doses, you saw a bigger response. So when you say response, so I'm talking about the biomarker, okay? Now, one of the things that is really hard, we talked about this at the beginning of the trial, but I think it is sort of a tough thing when you're the one who's living with PKAN, is when you do a clinical trial that, you know, this is something that's not been given to people before. The FDA wants you to figure out, first and foremost, is it safe, is it well tolerated, and then you can get some biological measures. But we don't have thousands of people to be able to say, is it changing the course of disease? Is it making PKAN better or preventing it from progressing? We call that power. We don't have enough people to be able to determine that with confidence, to be able to say with confidence, is it making PKAN better? And that is something that I can tell you, but if you're the one who's like taking the stuff, or your child is taking the stuff, that's really what you want to know, right? And I can't tell you that. I'm not going to be able to tell you that from this trial. But that measure in blood, it tells us in a really powerful way that we are really on the right track here. Now, the hard question is, if you have somebody who's had PKAN for a while, can you move that needle in the right direction? Or can you stop it getting any worse? That's our hope, but we don't know that yet. And we will only know that when we start giving it to people long-term, and perhaps even more, you know, when we develop a newborn test, you know, and we can identify somebody with PKAN at birth and potentially start them on something then. But that doesn't change things for you. For you, our hope would be that if this holds out, if our data is as promising as we think it is, that, you know, potentially it could hold somebody level or prevent them from going down as fast as they would without it. That's our hope. But, you know, I don't want to make any wild claims here. I'm not a drug company. I want to try to be realistic here, but we're pretty encouraged by these results because, like I said, it was a bit of a moonshot that we would see, we'd prove our point, and we are feeling at this point that we have shown what we set out to do. It even followed the pattern that we were expecting, and, you know, a lot of things about the results are really sort of powerful and compelling to us that we're on the right track. So let me just say a few words about follow-on studies. So to your point, we saw this suggestion that the biomarker, the measure in blood, responded more to higher doses than to lower doses. And we'd like to kind of drill into that a bit more with some perhaps smaller studies where we're just for very short periods of time testing higher doses yet. If the Food and Drug Administration and, you know, our safety board and everybody, once they've fully reviewed the data, they say they think it's okay for us to do that. These would be studies where we try to use the kind of infrastructure that we've already got in place, namely, you all went to your local lab, you all had that setup who were participating in the trial, where we didn't have people come to Oregon, fly to Oregon and do a study like that, but rather to do it in your own community. You've already got a kind of a system set up where we can send you stuff, you can get blood drawn locally, those kinds of things, send us bloods. We are wanting to do some smaller, shorter studies, literally just a few days of CoAZ at different doses with blood collections. Now, this would be asking a lot of you, and some of you, especially parents of young children with PKAN, may opt not to do this because it's going to be, short periods of treatment and blood draws kind of before and after, and if your kid hates blood draws and pitches a fit, you may choose not to do this. It's also something where the timing is going to be super important to get those blood draws in order for us to be able to answer those questions. And so we'll tell you more about what those studies look like when we're a bit closer to knowing whether we're allowed to do them or not. And then, but we're going to send out a survey that is just not, do you want to participate, but if this is what a study looks like, do you think you might be interested? Just an anonymous survey so we can hear from the community, hell yes or hell no. I do that. We'll tell you more about what it would look like. What else should I tell folks? It's probably more than I planned, actually. So one other point, because our desire was that everybody in the community, the trial community particularly, and potentially in the wider PKAN community, would kind of hear this information all at the same time. We'd ask you to keep it under your hat. I would just point out there are some other parties at this conference who would be quite interested to know our results, and we'd rather that you did not share them. So please keep them confidential until we've had an opportunity to share with the whole PKAN community, and then I think it'll be probably public knowledge at that point. But right now, if you would, we'd ask you to keep it confidential. Thank you for that. Yeah, Chris.
Is there any way for you guys to measure the blood-brain barrier? You know what I'm trying to say?
Does it get into the brain?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that the question?
Yes.
So the question, and you correct me if I'm not right here, is there a way to know whether you put CoAZ in your mouth, does it get into your brain?
Yes.
Okay, good question. Because we're measuring the blood, we're not taking a piece of your brain every time you take a dose of CoAZ, because we're not allowed to do that. You might not think it, but you look a lot like a mouse. And all of you look a lot more like mice than you think you are. So we share, this is a roundabout way of answering your question, but you share most of your characteristics, your DNA, most of your makeup is remarkably similar to mice. And so the way we do get to look in the brain is we can do that experiment on mice before we ever give something to humans. And we did a lot of studies on mice before we ever got to the CoAZ trial. And it is pretty clear that CoAZ gets into the brain, no question about it. So the same measure that we measured in you all's blood, we were measuring that exact same thing, not only in the brain, but in the very specific part of the brain that is affected by PKAN, where the eye of the tiger is. You remember that phrase, the eye of the tiger, which is that thing that you see on MRI? It's a very particular part of the brain that is affected by PKAN. And so in a mouse, we can measure what CoAZ is doing there in that part of the brain. We can't do that in humans, but because you are so much like a mouse, we can assume if we see the same thing in the blood of mice as we see in blood of humans, we see something in the brain of mice, we can make some reasonable assumptions that the same thing is happening in humans. And so, yeah. It does not. I mean, we didn't specifically look at that in this trial. We weren't doing any imaging, as you know, any MRIs or anything like that. But we wouldn't really expect that because that eye of the tiger kind of gets established pretty early on in PKAN, like really early. And we wouldn't really expect that to change. And in fact, it may not be telling us very much about whether the disease is changing. So, all right, I'm going to stop talking now. Yeah. A 1 year, yeah, we were hoping to do it for 3 years total. So when we first designed the trial, we actually planned it the way that it worked out, which was 6 months plus 18 months, so 2 years total. And then, because it was really a function of people enrolled so quickly, and I nearly killed our team, probably, because we enrolled people so quickly that we actually realized we had the ability to be able to extend the trial with the funding we had. So this was done under amazing fundraising efforts by you to get us to the start of the trial through the Spoonbill Foundation, and then through a big National Institutes of Health grant is what was funding the actual trial itself, most of it anyway, some of it. We realized that we could extend it and maybe expand the number of people in the study. Originally it was planned for 50 people, and then we enrolled so quickly, we expanded it to 65 people, 64 people. And then there were a few more people came in after that. And we thought we were going to be able to continue for 3 years. What happened? So we started our trial, which was planned as a remote clinical trial with you all staying in your homes and getting blood draws locally. We started it in December of 2019. Can you even remember the world in December of 2019? We had never heard of coronavirus. We had never heard of COVID. And just by dumb luck, I would love to tell you it was good planning on my part because I'm brilliant, but it was just dumb luck that we planned this as a trial that could be done remotely. So unlike almost every other clinical trial in the world, our clinical trial cruised on with barely a blink. However, eventually the pandemic did catch up with us, and that's why we wound up having to back off from our grand plans for 3 years because, you know, I know nobody wants to hear supply chain, but it was actually a supply chain issue. And if you want to hear the really dumb part of it, it wasn't so much the pandemic, it was the deep freeze in Texas that foiled us. Do you remember that really bad snowstorm where things froze in Texas? And the plant that makes a critical resin for the final step for synthesis of our product, for purification, is made at, so it's not actually part of CoAZ, it's part of the purification process. All of the machines that made that resin froze, and they had to rebuild the machines. And so we couldn't get the resin for the final purification step of our compound, and we couldn't make the next batch in time for people to continue. So it was something as dumb as that. It wasn't even the pandemic. But we couldn't risk, like, suddenly having to shut the trial down. And so we decided to try to end it in an orderly way with people concluding at 2 years so that we could trust our data. Okay. I've talked longer than I had allotted, so I'm going to stop talking now, and we'll move on to all your questions about clinical questions in PKAN. I hope, my cautious self, Susan wants me to have a little more caffeine in the morning or something to sound more excited, but I hope you know that I'm excited about these results. I think that they prove something pretty powerful in PKAN, that we are on the right track. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the community for participating as they did, for getting all those blood draws done, for shipping all those samples, for just sticking with us through thick and thin, oh yes, and a pandemic, and a deep freeze in Texas. Okay, I'll stop talking.
Is this one on?
Got one. Yep.
So you all had the chance to submit questions before today that you wanted to have covered, and it's okay if you didn't. You can just ask them on the fly this morning as well. We've still got a little under an hour left.
Should I invite anybody? Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Are people out?
Thank you, Sarah. So we did have a few questions submitted. Some of them are about research status of other investigators, and it's hard for us to answer for them. So there was a question about what's going on at Yale with Dr. Chokri Ben Mamoun, and there was a question about what's going on with the COA Bridge Bio trial, and I think I should just leave those for them for Saturday, because those groups will be here and they can speak, and they've got a lot of time allotted. So let's put a hold on those. There was a question about individualized medicine in PKAN, and particularly the program in Spain, having some success possibly with sort of supplement cocktails. And the person who asked this seemed to have a pretty good understanding that maybe in the past there's been some question about the peer review of that work, but wondered kind of what's going on with that now, and if other investigators have a relationship established with that group in Spain. So I'm hoping Susan can maybe just briefly speak on that.
Sure. So this is a group in Sevilla, Spain. Initially an academic group, and then they spun off a company. So what they were selling was, if you sent cells to them, this is now a few years back, but if you sent your child's cells to them, they would test those cells in a test tube and sprinkle the cells with various compounds, mostly over-the-counter supplements, and see if the measures that they had of disease in those cells was improved by the various supplements. And then they would tell you what those supplements were, and you could buy those and feed them to your family member. The issues around that are many. So first of all, it was pretty much of an unregulated, quote, service. That is, there was no evidence that that whole workflow led to any kind of improvement in people. Basically, it's not, in my view, it's not so far from the snake oil idea. It's a kind of a modern day snake oil thing. And it's not to say that that what they were doing was necessarily of no value to people trying to figure out how to help their family member. It's just that they hadn't gone through the steps to show that it had value. They hadn't gone through a peer review process. So the way that cells behave in a dish, what they were testing, is very different than how a human is. Cells have no blood-brain barrier, Chris, and so how do you know that these compounds are even going to reach the brain? The other issue I had was that it was a very expensive, in my view, service, and it was profiteering. I had very low enthusiasm. I think the company actually either closed down for a variety of possible reasons or was closed down, and now he offers that service in an academic setting. I don't know whether he charges for that service, and I think he just asks for the mutation type, and then he says he can tell you what kinds of supplements to use. For me, the bar is, there's two bars for this kind of thing. One is, what's the risk of harm? well, I guess it's kind of one bar. What's the risk of harm? And harm can be either literally toxic, something toxic to your family member, and the other is kind of soaking your wallet. That is financial harm. And it sounds like they maybe are not charging any longer. I don't know that for sure. But most of the compounds are over the counter. And, you know, you can take those supplements and you can try them, just like we tell you to try pantothenate. We've been telling you that since we found the gene. We actually, the day we found the gene, that evening, I shipped a bottle of pantothenate to the Amish family that helped us discover the gene, because we thought, you know, there's no harm in trying it. And so most of the supplements that I think are on the list of things that he is recommending are supplements you can go buy now and try on your kid. I don't think that the test results that he's seeing in his laboratory give any guidance to what might be beneficial. And I can also tell you that for most of the kids with classic disease, we think pantothenate probably does not help. I did want to make a comment. I just wanted to highlight the expertise of the other two people. You know, Penny and I get a lot of press around here, but so two child neurologists, not child neurologists, and a lot of experience with how to kind of take care of the particular needs of your kids. And so I want to, even if you don't ask the questions here, I want to encourage you to kind of pull them off and talk to you about questions you have about your kids. We used to have a physiatrist here, Tamara Zagustin. I don't know if any of you remember her, Dr. Tamara. But Jenny's actually a really good alternate, since Tamara's no longer able to join us. So I just want to encourage you to ask them questions also.
I've actually got the next one teed up for you too. So this question, I'm guessing, was submitted from a parent of a child with classic disease, because it's something I think many of us have seen or can relate to. It's what comfort measures can you offer a person who has severe dystonia? And then there is a very, very apt and specific description of dystonia where your foot is over your head and you're bent like a pretzel, and I think we've all seen that or may see that at some point this weekend. But maybe Dr. Wilson and Dr. Hull can sort of address, you know, the beginning of treating dystonia versus severe dystonia, and sort of what you've got in your arsenal for going through that progression with these families.
Yeah, I think this is the big quality of life issue that impacts all individuals with PKAN, and particularly classic PKAN. And unfortunately, we don't have the magic fix for dystonia. It's fairly difficult to treat. So we sort of have to walk this balance of doing our best to treat symptoms if we can, if they're bothersome, without, you know, getting all those side effects like over-sedation that then kind of take your child away from you, essentially. So that's the line we're walking, and early on, it's, you know, maybe trying a little bit of trihexyphenidyl or Artane or a little baclofen if kids are uncomfortable, maybe some injections if there are specific areas that are bothersome. And as the disease progresses and kids have more and more discomfort or related to their dystonia, then sometimes we add on more treatment in the hopes of making them comfortable and keeping them still, you know, interactive, engaged, and able to, you know, enjoy life. And I think a big part of dystonia management is the triggers. So the vast majority of the time, we do a better job of treating whatever's worsening the dystonia than treating the dystonia itself. I've run into this many, many times. I've learned this lesson over and over, that we can pile on medication and medication, but it's always important to go back to, hey, is there something that's making this worse right now? And you know, you can never be too thoughtful or careful about that. And you know, sometimes even just over-medicating can worsen the dystonia if a child's distressed or upset that they can't interact, and then the dystonia is worse. So it's just a real active, engaged process to kind of find that balance.
Yeah, so definitely step number one is trying to figure out, are there any triggers that we can help? So is there pain that's happening somewhere? Is there an infection that could possibly be triggering things? Was there some sort of medication change that potentially exacerbated things? So those are all of the things that we want to think about. And then after we have likely used a variety of medicines as well as potentially Botox injections or other types of injections, then we start to think of more surgical or more invasive things to do to help with the dystonia when it becomes really severe and really impairing. So there are a few things that we can consider in terms of severe dystonia and management. One that you probably have heard a fair amount about is deep brain stimulation. And so with deep brain stimulation surgery, essentially what's done is there are small electrodes that are placed in the deeper structures of the brain that are thought to help modulate some of the dystonia. Now, this may be more helpful earlier on in the disease, may not be as helpful as the disease progresses. So that's something to consider. There are some benefits to this versus some of the other options where some might think about a baclofen pump, for example, where essentially some medicine, baclofen, is provided straight into the nervous system to help provide some relaxation. So that one, you have a pump that is usually placed sort of in the abdomen, and a catheter that's placed somewhere in the spine, and that medicine sort of coats your nervous system and gets straight to the source. And then lastly, there are some palliative surgeries that can be done if there are particular areas that are more problematic. So for example, if the legs in particular are very dystonic, then there are palliative rhizotomies that can be done, which essentially weakens some of those fibers that cause too much stiffness in the legs. Now, the reason why there's all of these different options for dystonia is kind of like what Dr. Wilson mentioned. We don't have great treatments. It's really sort of an individualized treatment plan, and oftentimes we need to think about things in combination for everybody. If we had a great treatment for dystonia, there'd be one or two options at most, but most of the time we don't have that.
And I guess just to add, we don't have great data either to say that one particular treatment's the right way to go. And I don't think everybody with PKAN ends up getting a surgical or invasive option. There can be some downsides to that. And there are plenty of kids who, that may not be the right choice. And we get pretty creative when we treat dystonia. So I've had situations where I feel like I've tried everything, and then I step out of the box and think about a medicine that's used for seizures in babies. And all of a sudden, I have this great rescue medicine that works fantastically for a patient. So I think being creative, and sometimes we kind of head towards a surgical direction, but find that we can go a different direction, and that may be okay too.
I just wanted to make one other comment, and that is that around the idea of sort of identifying those triggers and trying to either avoid them or having kind of some tricks up your sleeve when something does, kind of something identifiable does trigger dystonia. Many of those responses, music, a fan, the videos run out and the kids' dystonia worsens because their videos ended and they're like, I want to watch that again. Many of those actually are things that you taught us. So I feel like, we're sitting up here telling you, but my message to you is that you often have really very valuable insight into the person that you're taking care of, or into yourself. this is the kind of thing that agitates me, and I notice that my dystonia is worse when I do this, or when we do this with my child, and I can think of some ways to either avoid that or to minimize that, and so it's almost self-care for those of you who are older with PKAN, or for those of you with children with PKAN. It's trusting yourself, the things you recognize as a parent, and either avoiding them or trying to minimize them.
Can I just make one of the comments? So this is specifically for parents who have a child with classic PKAN. It's more relevant, but it is somewhat relevant to the older folks with PKAN as well. So we use trihexyphenidyl, which is also called Artane, very commonly in childhood, and it can be quite effective in treating dystonia to a degree. Sometimes quite dramatically so, sometimes not so much. I would say that dystonia is something that is probably more individualized than some movement disorders. Like, you can't always predict which drug is going to be most helpful, but trihexyphenidyl is pretty commonly used and often is quite helpful. It's sort of counterintuitive, meaning it doesn't seem to make sense. You know, you're taught that the higher the dose of something, the more likely it is to cause side effects, and that is almost always true, certainly in adults. In children, for trihexyphenidyl, it turns out, or Artane, you can use much higher doses in a child than you can in an adult. If you gave some of our adults the doses that we give kids, they'd sleep for a week, or just would be so loopy and loony that it would be a problem. So one of the things is, as a child ages, I think something that parents can do is to challenge their doctors to keep looking at their medication regimen and to actually sometimes think about backing off. And I particularly mention Artane, trihexyphenidyl, because the things that get more noticeable as that child ages into teenage years and beyond are the things that can then trigger dystonia. So the side effects of Artane, one of the most problematic is constipation, which can progress to a complete bowel shutdown. And that can be a very big problem, because then the child or the young adult has pain, they get nausea, they get, really terrible trouble. And then we're in a medical emergency and we're trying to manage dystonia in the intensive care unit in a surgical setting, and you're in a whole heap of trouble. And it's not to say this could always be avoided, but I think as the years go by, every single visit, particularly as a child ages into teenage years and then into early adulthood, to keep looking at the medication regimen and see if what made sense for that 7-year-old makes sense for a 17-year-old, because the now young adult may be having a different set of challenges with the medication that they wouldn't have had when they were 7. Does that make sense? Just, keep your eye on things.
Penny, don't give away the microphone just yet. So just because I know we do have several adults here with atypical PKAN, and the original question was more geared at kids, but for adults who are more Parkinsonian or have maybe slightly different challenges, is there anything else you'd want to add as the adult movement disorders?
Yeah, so this is another way in which I think you all have taught us. So I would say early on, not even early on, for the many years in PKAN, and this is still largely true, we felt that the Parkinson's drugs, of which there are several, really didn't help PKAN. And that is still mostly true, but I think for people with atypical, so later onset, not the child with severe PKAN who's aged, but for those who have slower onset and are walking and doing fine in their late teens, 20s, and beyond. doing fine. They still have PKAN, but they're not like our little kids. I think sometimes being open to Parkinson's medicines, a trial of it, is something that you all have challenged me to rethink, because I think some of the Parkinson's medicines are sometimes helpful in people with atypical PKAN. And it is worth a careful trial to see if there is benefit, to see if the person has benefit with it. And then, again, I think it is some of the same drugs that we use in childhood are going to be helpful in adulthood, but you have to be especially careful about side effects as time goes by. I'd also just sort of make a follow-up comment about DBS, because we haven't had an entirely positive experience with DBS in childhood. And that may be in part because it's often thought about at the time of a crisis. So when a little kid is in trouble in the ICU and we get a call saying, you know, we want to take them to surgery for DBS, and that often is a very, very challenging time to try to do that surgery and have things go well. Also, I think the very severe dystonia is a tough thing to, we call it programming, to twiddle the DBS knobs to find the right settings. And I think, unlike some things with deep brain stimulation, the effects are really slow to change, and so you can't always tell that the change you made 2 weeks ago is what's improving or worsening things now. It's a tough thing to manage. And then finally, I would say that if an adult has really severe dystonia and is moving around a lot or just is twisting a lot, you know, you can have problems with skin breakdown, and then that's a whole world of hurt sometimes in somebody who's got an implant in that, you know, you're then looking at potentially a second surgery. However, I do think we've got a small number of adults who have atypical PKAN who, you know, again, this has challenged me, have had some benefit with deep brain stimulation. It's really small number to be able to make too many conclusions from, but certainly some of our colleagues in Europe, I think, have had maybe a better experience with DBS than we hear about in our group from the community. So those are my comments. I don't know whether that's what you had in mind, but.
So those were all the questions you submitted, but I'm happy to get up like Oprah and walk around and hand you guys the microphone if there are more questions now. This is your time just for PKAN with these wonderful specialists. And yeah, Carol's got her finger up.
I just had a question about fainting spells. In the past year, we've had an issue with quite a few fainting spells, and the cardiologist couldn't find any cause for it, and he asked if other PKAN individuals had experienced this, or if it's maybe something not even related to PKAN.
I can't say that I've heard of that. So I would, and one of the things is when you have a really kind of big, important diagnosis like PKAN that gets everybody's attention, the natural tendency is to blame everything that happens on that diagnosis. And people have stuff that's unrelated. And so again, for you as individuals with PKAN, for you as family members helping to navigate the medical system, I think one of your challenges and jobs and really great moments of advocacy is to challenge the providers, the medical providers, to not assume that everything that happens is related to PKAN. And that's true no matter what, whether we're talking about PKAN or BPAN or whatever, but I think there's a natural tendency to do that. So I have not, and you know, in our natural history study, we get a lot of information from a lot of people. And one of the things that Alison, I've got to totally give her credit for, is very good at picking up on, hey, we've now had 4 people who've said this and who've told us about that. And So then we start to dig into it in a more systematic way, and we found some really important things that way in the natural history studies. We have not found, I've not heard about these fainting spells.
So I'm going to ask Penny a question. What about postural hypotension in Parkinson's disease, and what about a side effect from the medications?
Yeah. So it's a good point. So any medication, you know, when somebody is considering why does somebody have fainting spells, probably the item 1 through 5 that you look at is what medications they're on, and could some of the medications be responsible? In Parkinson's disease, and I do want to emphasize that people with PKAN who have symptoms that look a bit like Parkinson's, they don't have Parkinson's disease. And so you can't make too many assumptions that what's true for Parkinson's disease is true for PKAN with a bit of Parkinsonism, is what we call it. But that said, you know, the medication's going to have the same side effects. So if you're on a Parkinson's medicine in particular, I think looking at that medicine and all of the other medicines to see if they could be dropping blood pressure, causing fainting spells, is one really important thing to make sure there's not any cardiac heart issues going on that could be causing fainting spells. And then for somebody with Parkinson's disease, we can see trouble regulating blood pressure, but we've not really seen that in PKAN patients, in fact, people with PKAN who have a little bit of Parkinsonism. I know that term is a bit weird, but Parkinsonism, it means looks like Parkinson's but isn't.
Martha Nell, hang on. In relation to the, can you hear me? In relation to the low blood pressure, we personally know 3 different people in our area that have stumped the doctors with the low blood pressure. One lady had never been sick in her life, never taken medicines. She is in her early 80s. But when she had COVID for the 2nd time, and she's type O, she is now having trouble with fainting spells and low blood pressure. They cannot get her blood pressure back up. And we know 2 other people with this same problem. I am not saying that this is it. Have you heard anything about low blood pressure in connection with COVID?
I'm a medical geneticist.
Yes, right. Well, I know there's
No,
some,
it's actually an important question, and it gets to what Penny was saying, that
there are some studies going on with this group
Yeah.
of people, mainly with type O blood, I understand. I don't know. I know Dallas is doing one study.
Yeah.
They are mainly older people.
Okay.
So,
Well, so we do know that COVID has a detrimental effect, a bad effect on blood vessels. So it may not, most people who have a COVID infection come through it and are okay, at least now, especially if you're vaccinated. But in the early days of COVID, and even still, we know that it damages blood vessels, and in some people it can damage the blood vessels very severely. And, you know, blood vessels are important in maintaining blood pressure. It also, we know that COVID affects the brain, not just the blood vessels in the brain, but the brain itself. And the brain controls blood pressure. It's one of the regulators of blood pressure. And so there are a number of, I could imagine a number of reasons why COVID might complicate things for sure around blood pressure.
And I think they know, they just can't, they can't prove any of them. They can't pinpoint any of these, you know, in the people that
I'm
we
slightly
know.
jealous that in COVID, so it speaks to the power of data. Because we had these great reporting systems put in place for COVID, I mean, no matter how you feel about how everything went, we got a lot of information about this brand new virus that we didn't know, we never even knew about until 3-4 years ago. And we're finding these super rare events that are real. So, you know, early on, nobody had a clue about the loss of sense of smell, right? And suddenly a whole ton of people were presenting with, they lost their sense of taste and smell. That's an effect of that virus. That was a common thing, but there's probably lots Like if anybody said to me, could COVID do X? My answer would be probably. in a very small subset of people. But when you've got millions of people around the world who've had COVID, we learn things about this virus. And yeah, sure. I mean, it absolutely could, but can I prove that in somebody that's having fainting spells? Probably not. And so, but yeah, I'm sure it could do anything, so.
Is there a difference in the brain scan of somebody with atypical with?
I think you're asking, does the MRI differ differ between classic and atypical PKAN?
Is that it?
Is that right?
Well, that and I was also wondering about the blood work with somebody with atypical.
Like the gene mutations, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So you're asking if the genetic variants, the mutations differ between classic and atypical. Is that correct? I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. Yeah, so the MRI is ultimately the same. There's an eye of the tiger in both of them. Most people show this eye of the tiger. It's kind of a characteristic pattern that doctors who've never seen anybody with PKAN are ready, when they do see that change, they're ready to make a diagnosis of PKAN. But it comes on a little bit later in atypical disease, and in people with classic disease, it's present usually at a much younger age. But then that kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that somebody with atypical disease maybe isn't even noticed to have anything that's interfering with their function until they're in their teenage years, for example. So nobody would have done an brain MRI when they were 4. But ultimately, the brain MRI is, I would say, the same. The mutations are very different, and the difference in mutations is the reason why somebody has classic or atypical. And our current understanding, our current thinking about this is that if you have classic disease, so genes are instructions that tell your body how to make a protein. And the instructions in classic disease lead to the formation of either no protein or no functional protein. And so it's a kind of as low functioning as you can get. It's basically, there's no functional pantothenate kinase 2. In atypical disease, which is everything else, so there's the group that has maybe 0 functional protein, and then there's everything else from 1% function up to maybe 20% function. Because maybe if you have 25% function, you don't even have PKAN, you're totally fine, right? Most parents carry 1 mutation and they're fine. There's no health impact whatsoever. So everybody else has atypical disease, and that's a function of their mutations. Their mutations make the protein, again, it's instructions that make a protein that's kind of able to do the work a little bit, but not very good at it. So they've got a malfunction, a dysfunction in their pantothenate kinase protein. But there is some present, and it's kind of a little bit able to do its job, and that's what lessens it slows down the progression of disease. It makes the onset later, and it makes the rate of change of disease a bit slower than in classic disease.
All right, who else? Anybody else want to ask? Yes, Brenda, here.
Okay, first question, do my boys have classical or atypical? Because it was later onset, but very severe.
So it's important to understand that even though we talk about them in 2 buckets, there's one bucket, and then there's the bucket exactly right next door, and then there's like the bucket over here, and everything else gets called atypical disease. I would say your boys have an aggressive form of atypical disease, but it starts to become kind of like splitting hairs, and does it really matter? Your boys are your boys. I mean, they have a flavor of PKAN that is unto themselves. Every one of you who has either has PKAN or has a family member with PKAN, you have your own flavor of PKAN is your own, even in a family, right? Siblings with PKAN, cousins with PKAN, it's not the same. The very first family I met, the Amish family, they had 3 daughters, classic disease, pretty similar, but not identical. And then there was a cousin, same mutations, identical mutations. She was walking, and they had classic disease. She was walking when she was 13, but she had problems with her vision. Otherwise, very, very healthy. So
Yeah, the
even
boys
within
were
a family.
very different in presenting.
Yep.
But they're very much the same
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
This next question is, I'm not sure if this is the right place to ask it, but now that my boys aren't peds anymore, and you know, we fought the dystonia battle with Ben in the PICU, with you guys' help, we found the elixir that kind of controlled his dystonia. So we pray every time we go to the hospital that they have a bed in the PICU, because they'll take them
Yeah.
if they can. But they are always at risk of being kicked out in case a ped needs that bed. So we don't know where to go. It's like there's no place for us in the hospital. And when the adult doctors see how much clonidine they take, their head explodes, and we've had a doctor refuse to give them. Frank and I stayed in the room, and we gave every drop of medicine to Ben and every ounce of food, because they just didn't seem where they put us. You know, during COVID, they're just looking for a bed. They didn't know what to do with us. So what should I ask for? Where do we belong in the adult world that can do for them what the PICU does in controlling or getting control of their dystonia again? Is there a place for us?
I don't know that I have a good answer. I think this is a really tough question that we face in pediatric neurology for quite a number of different conditions, where our kids are really best served in the PICU and the framework that the PICU has, and when they have to go to the adult side, it's not good. It's a very different level of care, and they don't get the same compassion sometimes, and treatment of family and involvement of family, and ooh, it's a big system problem. So I don't know that I have a great answer. I mean, I think as long as the PICU can take care of your boys, that's great. But I think in the broader picture is we need better transition of care, and we need better adult neurologists who learn like pediatric neurologists learn, which is something our field, I think, hopefully is working towards, is training our adult neurologists to be comfortable with pediatric diseases. We face this in cerebral palsy as well, where adult neurologists are like, So I don't know that I have an immediate answer.
Yeah, I agree. I think, transition is hard for especially all of these children that have chronic neurological conditions. And so oftentimes you will see that some institutions are trying to put into place what are called transition clinics, where it's more of a multidisciplinary approach, and you have some adult providers as well as some pediatric providers trying to work together to learn more. But I think those are few and far between. I mean, I can speak for here as they're still in the learning process. Ideally, if you can find a place that, both the pediatric neurologists or pediatric movement disorder specialists are working closely with the adult and can have some relationship in which it's sort of a slow transition, It doesn't take away the systems issue of the actual inpatient hospitalization. And so sometimes PICUs will be more willing to take on patients that, we've taken care of these kids for so long, we've taken care of the families, we have good relationships. We'd all love for that to continue into the adult world, but I think it's going to be growing pains, and we just have to continue to advocate and work on these things.
I've even tried to, our PICU doctors are incredible. They love my boys, and I think they'd probably come to my house if I asked them. But I say, can you consult with Dr. Martin? And then the adult world, they're just kind of view pediatrics as some baby medicine that they don't want to deal with. And we've landed in neuro ICU, which seems like that should be a good fit, but they're dealing with stroke patients, and they don't really have any idea how to, and I'm always like, well, here, let me give you Allison's number, because Allison will give you their number. Allison won't give me their number, but she'll give it to the doctor, because Dr. Martin will come to me, I think we need to call. It's like, well, you have their number. I have Allison's number. But anyway, that's okay. But they don't want to. They don't want to. And as they get older and older, my boys have beards now. And, they're laying in the PICU. Well, Frank tries to do that, but they come back pretty quick. They're hairy dudes. And, you see other moms walking, all the PICU doors, the glass, and, they're walking by like, that's a man in there. But they know how to help them. And so we pray every time we go to the hospital that we can land in the PICU, but I don't know.
I'm hoping or wondering about finding that one champion, somebody in adult neurology or adult medicine, physiatry, doesn't matter, but somebody who's will go a little bit beyond, or will reach out and is maybe young enough to still have that.
I wanted to let you all know that, so we're here in this session, but between clinical sessions today and tomorrow, we're set up to obtain blood samples and tiny bites of skin, like little tiny skin biopsies. And I wanted to invite, we've got some priorities. Our priorities are blood from people with PKAN, blood from your parents, that is, parents of people with PKAN. Those are two super high priorities for us, and they relate back to the clinical trial work. And so if you're able to give a sample, we would be really appreciative. That we're set up, we have a specialized blood drawer back there, and I'm doing the skin biopsies. I think I and one other person are doing the skin biopsies. If you've had a skin biopsy before, and many of you with PKAN have, we don't want another one. The good news is that those cells grow for not exactly forever, but for a very, very long time. But if you haven't had a skin biopsy and you are interested in contributing a sample, particularly if you're on the younger end, if you're 20s, 30s, 40s, we would welcome that opportunity. So we have a little process set up for telling you what we're doing, consenting you, making sure you're good with it, and then doing a little bit of sampling. We're doing that between the PKAN and BPAN sessions, after the BPAN session today, and then I think we're going to be doing it tomorrow morning as well. So just thank you in advance for your willingness to engage with us.
And that's in Galleria C, which is like you go to the elevators and then down the hall past, like through the restaurant, and it's down on the left.
I just have to tell you that Dr. Hayflick, with the help of Mark Karakortis, who many of you know, who's a oromaxillofacial surgeon who has a son, Drew, with PKAN. She has a Texas license for 3 days, medical license for 3 days, which is no small thing, let me tell you. It is a lot of work on everybody's part, particularly Mark Karakortis, bless his socks. So she's going to have a 10-gallon hat on and, you know, cowboy boots or whatever. I don't know what she'll have on, but anyway, so she'll be the one wielding the skin biopsy tool, just because I think skin biopsy might sound a little scary to people. Most people know what a blood draw is, but a skin biopsy, it's actually not as big a deal as you might think. If you haven't had a skin biopsy, we clean the skin really well. We inject it with a little tiny bit of local anesthetic, numbing medicine. That stings just a little bit. The sting goes away, your skin is numb, and then we take this tool that looks like if you look at it under magnifying glass, and you really do have to look at it under magnifying glass, it looks like a tiny little apple cora. So with your numb skin, we take a tiny little bite of skin, which is about the size of a quarter of an apple seed. You can barely see it when it's put in the tube. So it's, you know, it's kind of like a nick shaving or something like that. It really, and it doesn't usually require more than a Band-Aid. You know, we put a bandage around it with a pad on it, with a gauze on it, but it is a tiny little thing. So don't imagine that we're going to be doing brain surgery on you. It's a really small event. And there'll be another doctor there who's coming from Baylor with oh, Dr. Nadia, you're here. Stand up, wave your hand. So I didn't know you were in the room because we've never met before. Welcome. Dr. Nadia very, very graciously agreed to join us today to have 2 Texas licensed physicians now in the room to be able to do those procedures. And then we have some blood draw expertise who are coming from a local company who've done lots of pediatric and adult blood draws. And so it's a big deal. Thank you so much for thinking about that.
Yeah, so Dr. Hamoud is a fellow with Dr. Jankovic. She's training as a movement disorders neurologist, I think almost a month away from being fully trained as an adult movement disorders neurologist. So she's here for skin biopsies, but also a good person to tap if you have questions for another movement disorders neurologist. Thank you all.
Yeah, so I think maybe we can, oh, you have one more question? All right, this is the last question. Then I think we should probably just leave it to if you want to approach people with individual questions, and we can like move towards the bio sample room.
But approach us for questions after we're around through Sunday, most of us.
And we've only got Dr. Nadia and Dr.
Yeah.
Susan at the skin biopsy room for a limited number
Yeah, so I'm going to
time.
beeline over to the sample room.
Okay, thanks you guys. We'll see you throughout the meeting.